The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence as the heavy oak doors creaked open. Everyone expected a broken woman to walk in a poor, discarded wife, begging for scraps. Instead, Sarah walked in clutching two identical toddlers, wearing a dress that had seen better days, while her husband's mistress, Tiffany, snickered from the front row draped in diamonds. They thought this hearing was a formality. They thought Sarah was just a waitress Julian had plucked from obscurity. But when Judge Sterling finally looked up from the sealed envelope on his desk, his face wasn't pitying. It was terrified. The secret he was about to read wouldn't just end a marriage, it would destroy an empire. The air inside the Superior Court of Manhattan smelled of floor wax and expensive cologne. It was a scent that Julian Thorne knew well. It was the scent of victory. Julian adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, glancing at the gold Rolex on his wrist. 9:05 a.m. His wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, was late. Again. A smirk played on his lips. It was typical of Sarah. Disorganized, frantic, always smelling of baby powder and cheap laundry detergent. She didn't belong in a room like this. She didn't belong in his world. Beside him, Tiffany Blair crossed her long, tanned legs. She was the polar opposite of Sarah. Tiffany was sharp, gleaming, and predatory. She wore a white pencil skirt suit that cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe, and her blonde hair was styled in a perfect sleek bob. She placed a manicured hand possessively on Julian's arm, her fingers tracing the fabric of his jacket. "Is she going to show up, do you think?" Tiffany whispered, her voice a purr that carried just enough volume for the reporters in the back row to hear. "Or did she finally realize she's out of her depth?" Julian chuckled, leaning back in his leather chair. "Sarah is stubborn, Tiff, but she's not smart. She'll come. She thinks if she cries enough, the judge will give her the house. She doesn't understand that the law doesn't care about tears. It cares about contracts." He tapped the thick folder in front of him. The prenuptial agreement. Ironclad. Unbreakable. Or so his lawyer Arthur Pendleton had assured him. Arthur was currently arranging his papers with the precision of a surgeon preparing to amputate a limb. He was the most expensive divorce attorney in New York, a man who didn't lose. "Don't worry, baby," Julian added, patting Tiffany's hand. "By noon, I'll be a free man, and you and I can finally start planning the wedding in Como." Tiffany beamed, glancing down at her flat stomach. "And our little heir will have a proper name, not like those baggage she carries around." She was referring to the twins. Leo and Mia. Julian felt a flicker of irritation at the mention of them. They were 3 years old, loud, messy, and needy. He had never wanted children, not really. Sarah had insisted. She had trapped him, he believed. She was just a waitress at a diner near his first office when they met. He had been charmed by her simplicity, her lack of pretense. But 5 years later, simple had turned into bring, and lack of pretense had turned into embarrassing. Now he was the CEO of Thorne Dynamics, a tech conglomerate on the verge of $1 billion merger. He needed a wife who could host galas, not one who clipped coupons and insisted on family dinners. He needed Tiffany. "All rise!" the bailiff bellowed, cutting through the murmurs of the gallery. The heavy door behind the bench opened, and Judge Harrison Sterling walked in. Sterling was a legend in the family court circuit. He was an older man, with steel-grey hair and eyes that looked like they had seen every lie humanity was capable of telling. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply existed as a force of judgment. Julian stood up, buttoning his jacket. He felt confident. He had the money, the lawyer, and the status. Sarah had nothing. "Be seated," Judge Sterling said, his voice gravelly. He arranged his robes and looked over the rim of his glasses at the empty table on the left side of the room. "The petitioner is present. Where is the respondent?" Arthur Pendleton stood up, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, it appears Mrs. Thorne has failed to appear at the scheduled time. Given her history of instability and lack of respect for these proceedings, we move to proceed with a default judgment in favor of my client, Mr. Thorne." Judge Sterling looked at the clock. "It is 9:08, Mr. Pendleton. I will give her 5 more minutes. This involves the custody of 2 minors. I do not take that lightly." Tiffany let out an audible sigh of annoyance, rolling her eyes. Julian squeezed her knee under the table to quiet her. 5 minutes, Julian muttered under his breath. "She's probably waiting for the bus." The gallery chuckled. It was packed with spectators. A divorce involving Julian Thorne was headline news. The press painted it as a classic tale, the titan of industry shedding the starter wife for the upgrade. Everyone loved a winner, and Julian looked like a winner. The minutes ticked by. 9:10. 9:12. Arthur stood up again. "Your Honor, really, this is a waste of the court's—" Bam! The double doors at the back of the courtroom flew open, hitting the walls with a resounding crash. The silence that followed was instant. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Sarah. She looked exhausted. Her brown hair, usually pulled back in a messy bun, was loose and slightly frizzy from the humidity. She wore a grey cardigan that was 2 sizes too big and a faded floral dress that Julian recognized from 3 years ago. She had dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. But she wasn't alone. Holding her left hand was Leo, and holding her right was Mia. The twins were dressed impeccably, in stark contrast to their mother. Leo wore a tiny navy suit, and Mia wore a white dress with a blue ribbon. They looked like porcelain dolls, clutching their mother's hands as if she were their only anchor in a storm. Sarah didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the gallery. Her eyes locked onto Julian's. There was no fear in them. There was only a cold, hard resolve that he had never seen before. "I'm here," Sarah said, her voice steady, echoing in the quiet room. "And I brought the children, because they need to see this." "You brought children into a courtroom?" Tiffany blurted out, breaking the stunned silence. She laughed a harsh, jagged sound. "God, Julian, she really has no class. Who drags toddlers to a divorce hearing?" "Order," Judge Sterling barked, banging his gavel. His eyes narrowed at Tiffany. "One more outburst from the gallery, or the parties involved, and I will have you removed. Is that clear?" Tiffany shrank back, her face flushing pink. She muttered a sorry that sounded more like a curse. Sarah ignored her. She walked down the center aisle, her movements slow and deliberate. The twins trotted beside her, their small shoes clicking on the floor. Leo looked around with wide, curious eyes, while Mia hid her face in Sarah's skirt. Arthur Pendleton leaned over to Julian. "This is a ploy," he whispered urgently. "She's using the kids as props to gain sympathy from the judge. It's the poor mother act. Don't react, look indifferent." Julian nodded, stiffening his jaw. He looked at his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife, with a practiced look of boredom. "She looks like she slept under a bridge," he whispered back. Sarah reached the defendant's table. There was no lawyer waiting for her. She pulled out a chair for herself and then lifted Leo and Maya onto the bench behind her, whispering something in their ears. She handed them a small tablet to keep them quiet. "Mrs. Thorne," Judge Sterling said, looking over his spectacles. You are late, and you are unrepresented. Where is your legal counsel?" Sarah stood up. She looked small in the vast room, surrounded by wood paneling and men in expensive suits. She placed a worn canvas tote bag on the table. "I don't have a lawyer, Your Honor," Sarah said. Her voice was soft but clear. "I couldn't afford one. Julian froze my accounts 3 weeks ago." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Julian clenched his fist. That was true. But it was standard procedure, wasn't it? Arthur Pendleton shot up. "Objection. Mr. Thorne secured the joint assets to prevent dissipation. We offered Mrs. Thorne a generous stipend, which she refused." "A stipend?" Sarah turned to look at Arthur, her eyes flashing. "You offered me $500 a week to feed 2 children and pay rent in New York City after Julian kicked us out of the brownstone. You left voluntarily," Julian interrupted, unable to help himself. "I left because you moved her in." Sarah pointed a shaking finger at Tiffany. "While I was at the grocery store. I came home and her bags were in the hallway and she was sitting in my kitchen drinking my tea." "That is enough." Judge Sterling slammed the gavel again. "This is not a soap opera. We will proceed with facts. Mr. Pendleton, you are petitioning for divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Arthur said, smoothing his jacket. "And we are enforcing the prenuptial agreement signed 5 years ago. It states clearly that in the event of a divorce, Mrs. Thorne receives a flat settlement of $50,000 and waives all rights to spousal support and any claim on Thorne dynamics." Tiffany smirked, whispering to Julian, "50 grand? That won't even cover my shopping trip tomorrow." Arthur continued, pacing the floor. "Furthermore, we are petitioning for full custody of the minor children Leo and Mia Thorne. We believe Mrs. Thorne is financially unstable and emotionally unfit to raise children of such stature. Mr. Thorne can provide them with the best schools, nannies, and environment. Mrs. Thorne is currently living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens. It is hardly a suitable environment." Sarah stood there, taking the blows. She didn't interrupt. She just listened as Arthur painted a picture of her as a pathetic, leeching failure. He brought up her lack of a college degree. He brought up her past work as a waitress. He made her sound like a stray dog Julian had made the mistake of feeding. When Arthur finally sat down looking smug, the judge turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Thorne," Sterling said, "you have heard the petition. You signed the prenup. Is there any reason this court should not enforce it?" Sarah took a deep breath. She reached into her canvas bag. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she pulled out a single, thick envelope. It wasn't a legal document filed by a lawyer. It was a brown manila envelope sealed with red tape. "I signed the prenup, yes," Sarah said, "because I loved him. I didn't care about the money." She looked at Julian. For a second, Julian felt a pang of something guilt. No, it was pity. She really had loved him. He knew that. That was what made her so easy to manipulate. "But," Sarah continued, her voice hardening, "Julian seems to have forgotten a specific clause in the addendum, the clause regarding the origin of intellectual property." Julian frowned. Origin of intellectual property. He didn't remember that. The prenup was standard. "And," Sarah said, placing the envelope on the judge's bench, "he also seems to have forgotten who I was before I was a waitress." Tiffany laughed out loud. "Who you were? You were nobody. You were scrubbing tables." Sarah turned to Tiffany, and for the first time she smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf that had just cornered a rabbit. "I was hiding, Tiffany," Sarah said softly. "I was taking a break from a life that you spend every waking moment trying to fake." Judge Sterling picked up the envelope Sarah had placed on his desk. He opened it. He pulled out a stack of documents. As he read the first page, his eyebrows shot up. He flipped to the second page. His eyes widened. He looked from the paper to Sarah and then to Julian. The judge's face went pale. He took a sip of water, his hand shaking slightly. "Mr. Pendleton," Judge Sterling said, his voice unusually high. "Did you read the entirety of the marriage contract, specifically Appendix C?" I assumed it was boilerplate, Your Honor," Arthur stammered. "Mr. Thorne drafted the initial terms himself before hiring my firm." Judge Sterling looked at Julian. "Mr. Thorne, this document, these patent numbers." The judge paused, looking at the twins playing quietly with their tablet. "Do you know whose names are on the original patents for the algorithm that runs Thorne Dynamics?" Julian scoffed. "Mine, obviously. I wrote the code." "No," Sarah cut in. "You wrote the interface, Julian. The code, the deep learning core that was written by SM." "Sarah Miller," Julian said, rolling his eyes. "My wife's maiden name. I put her initials on it as a romantic gesture. It means nothing." "It means everything," Judge Sterling said, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like thunder. "Because according to this deed of trust, Sarah Miller isn't just a name. It's an alias." The judge looked at Sarah with a newfound respect, bordering on fear. "Mrs. Thorne?" the judge asked. "Or should I say, Miss van der Hoven?" The room went dead silent. Julian froze. Van der Hoven. The name was royalty in the tech world. The Van der Hoven family owned the infrastructure of half the internet. They were old money, hidden money. Trillions, not billions. "Ms. van der Hoven," Sarah corrected. "And the twins aren't just Thorne heirs, Your Honor. They are the sole beneficiaries of the Van der Hoven global estate. And Julian," she looked at her husband, "he works for me. He just didn't know it." The silence in the courtroom stretched, heavy and suffocating. It was broken only by the sound of Julian's nervous laughter. It was a dry, cracking sound, devoid of humor. "Van der Hoven," Julian repeated, shaking his head as if trying to dislodge water from his ears. "Judge, please. She's Sarah Miller. She grew up in a trailer park in Ohio. I've seen the photos. I've met her. Well, I never met her parents because she said they were dead, but this is clearly a delusion. She's hired a forger. A good one, maybe, but this is insane." He turned to his lawyer, expecting validation. "Arthur, tell him. Tell him this is a federal crime. Presenting forged documents to a superior court judge." But Arthur Pendleton wasn't looking at Julian. He was leaning over the judge's bench, staring at the documents Sterling had spread out. Arthur's face, usually a mask of arrogant boredom, was now a sheet of pasty white sweat. He recognized the seal embossed on the paper. It wasn't a standard notary stamp. It was the gilded, raised crest of the Sovereign Trust of Zurich, accompanied by the signature of a senior partner at Baker McKenzie, one of the most prestigious law firms on the planet. "Julian," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. "Shut up." "Excuse me," Julian snapped. "I said, shut up," Arthur hissed, straightening up and looking at his client with eyes full of panic. "Your Honor, I need a moment to review this evidence. I was not made aware of any pre-existing trusts or alias identities." "There is nothing to review," Tiffany screeched from her seat. She stood up, her expensive handbag clutching tight against her chest. She's lying. Look at her. She's wearing rags. Does that look like a billionaire to you? She's a waitress. She served me coffee 3 years ago and spilled it. Sarah didn't flinch. She gently stroked Mia's hair as the little girl played with a lock of her mother's dress. Sarah looked up at Tiffany, her expression calm, bordering on bored. I spilled it because you pinched the waitress next to you, Sarah said quietly. I saw you. You enjoy making people feel small. It's why you like Julian. You're two hollow people trying to fill yourselves up with other people's misery. You little... Tiffany lunged forward, but the bailiff stepped in her path, hand on his holster. Sit down, Miss Blair, Judge Sterling ordered, his voice icy. Mr. Pendleton, you want to review the documents by all means, but let me summarize what I am seeing here so the court record is clear. The judge put on his reading glasses and picked up the thickest document. This is a deed of assignment for intellectual property, Sterling read. Dated 6 years ago. It assigns full ownership of the Thorn Deep Learning Architecture, the core code of your company, Mr. Thorn, to the Aurora Trust. At the time, Mr. Thorn, you signed this. I signed a release form, Julian argued, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Sarah told me it was just a formality, so she could help me debug the code without claiming overtime pay. I was protecting the company. You were trying to exploit free labor, Sarah corrected him. You didn't read it, Julian. You never read anything you think is beneath you. You saw a waiver and you signed, but it wasn't a waiver of my rights. It was a waiver of yours. Sarah stood up and walked toward the bench. She moved differently now. The hunch of the tired housewife was gone. She stood with the posture of a ballerina, or perhaps a CEO. My father is Peter van der Hoven, Sarah announced to the room. The reporters in the back row gasped. Keyboards began to clack furiously. Peter van der Hoven was a ghost in the financial world, a Dutch industrialist who had quietly bought up half the fiber optic networks in Europe before vanishing into privacy in the late 90s. I ran away when I was 19, Sarah continued. I hated the money. I hated the fake friends, the bodyguards, the paranoia. I wanted to see if I could make it on my own. I changed my name. I worked in diners. I lived in walk-ups. And then I met you, Julian. She looked at him, and for a moment her eyes softened with a memory of pain. I thought you were different. You were ambitious, hungry. You talked about changing the world with technology. I fell in love with your passion. So late at night while you slept, I fixed your code. I wrote the algorithms that made Thorn Dynamics work. I gave you the keys to the kingdom, Julian. All I wanted in return was a husband who loved me. I did love you, Julian shouted, desperate now. We had good times, Sarah. But you stopped trying. You got obsessed with the kids. You stopped coming to events. I stopped coming to events because I realized they were just markets for you to sell yourself, Sarah said. And when I got pregnant with the twins, I saw the way you looked at my stomach. You didn't see children. You saw expenses. You saw distractions. So you trapped me. Julian pointed a shaking finger at her. You hid your money to test me. That's entrapment. That's fraud. It's not fraud to be rich, Mr. Thorn, Judge Sterling said dryly, but it is fraud to list assets on a divorce petition that you do not own. The judge held up a piece of paper. According to this trust, Thorn Dynamics is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Aurora Trust. Julian Thorn is listed as the acting CEO with a contract that is revocable at any time. Sterling looked at Julian over his glasses. You don't own the company, son. You're an employee, and according to this performance review attached to the file, you're currently on probation. The color drained from Julian's face completely. He slumped into his chair. "Probation," he whispered. "For gross mismanagement of company funds," Sarah quoted from memory. "Specifically, redirecting R&D capital to personal expenses." She glanced at Tiffany. "Like penthouse apartments in Soho and diamond necklaces from Cartier." The room turned to Tiffany. The mistress was frozen, her mouth slightly open. The realization was hitting her like a slow-motion train wreck. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from shock to something sharper, more vicious. It was the smell of blood in the water. Tiffany Blair, who had spent the last hour preening like a peacock, suddenly looked like a cornered animal. Her eyes darted from Julian to the judge, and then to Sarah. Her mind was working furiously. She wasn't a genius, but she was a survivor. She knew how to count. Julian minus Thorne. Dynamics equaled 0. Julian minus the assets equaled debt. Julian plus an embezzlement investigation equaled prison. "Wait a minute," Tiffany said, her voice shrill. She stood up, ignoring the bailiff this time. She took a step away from Julian's table, creating a physical distance between them. "I didn't know anything about this." Julian looked up at her, betrayed. "Tiff, what are you doing?" "I didn't know," she screamed, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, I am a victim here. He told me he owned everything. He told me she was a leech. He bought me gifts. Yes, but I thought he was a successful businessman. If he stole that money, that has nothing to do with me." "Tiffany," Julian stood up, his face red with rage. "You begged for that apartment. You picked out the jewelry. You told me to get creative with the accounting when I said cash flow was tight." "Liar." Tiffany pointed a manicured nail at him. "I never said that." "You're the liar. You lied to her, and you lied to me." She turned to Sarah, her expression transforming instantly into a grotesque mask of sisterly pleading. Sarah, you know how he is," Tiffany said, her voice trembling with fake tears. "He's a manipulator. He used me just like he used you. I'm just a girl from Indiana, trying to make it in the city. I didn't know he was stealing from your trust. If I had known those diamonds were bought with your children's money, I never would have touched them." She began to unclasp the diamond necklace around her neck. Her fingers fumbled with the latch. "Here, take it back. I don't want it." She threw the necklace onto the defendant's table. It skidded across the wood and landed next to Sarah's canvas tote bag. Sarah didn't touch it. She just watched Tiffany unravel. "It's too late for returns, Tiffany," Sarah said coldly. "The forensic accountants have already traced the wire transfers. You accepted gifts totaling $3 million over the last 18 months. In the eyes of the IRS and the trust, you're an accessory to embezzlement." Tiffany gasped. She looked at Arthur Pendleton. "Do something, defend me." Arthur was busy packing his briefcase. He snapped the locks shut. "Mr. Pendleton," Julian asked, stunned, "where are you going?" "I'm recusing myself," Arthur said, not making eye contact. "I represent Julian Thorne, the owner of Thorne Dynamics. Since that person effectively doesn't exist, and since my retainer was paid from a corporate account that is now frozen by the actual owner," he glanced at Sarah, "I am currently working pro bono, and I don't work pro bono." "You can't leave me." Julian grabbed Arthur's sleeve. Arthur shook him off with a look of pure disgust. "I'd suggest you ask for a public defender, Julian, because once Mrs. Thorne, sorry, Ms. Vanderhoven files the criminal charges, this divorce hearing will be the least of your problems." Arthur walked out. The heavy doors closed behind him, with a finality that echoed like a prison cell slamming shut. Julian stood alone. His mistress had turned on him. His lawyer had fled. His empire was a mirage. He looked at the judge pleadingly. "Your Honor, please. We can work this out. Sarah." He turned to his wife. He tried to summon the charm that had won her over 5 years ago. He smiled, a weak, trembling thing. "Sarah, baby. Look at us. We're a family. We have Leo and Mia. You don't want to send the father of your children to jail, do you? Think about the twins." Sarah looked down at the twins. Leo was drawing on the tablet. Mia was asleep, her head on Sarah's lap. "I am thinking about them," Sarah said. "That's why I'm doing this." She picked up the envelope again and pulled out one last document. "There is one more twist, Julian," she said. "One more secret you didn't know." Judge Sterling leaned in. "Proceed, Ms. van der Hoven." "The trust isn't just for the company," Sarah explained. "My father, Peter, was a paranoid man. He set up the legacy clause. It states that if I were to marry, my spouse would undergo a 5-year vesting period. If after 5 years the marriage remained intact and faithful, the spouse would be granted 50% control of the assets." Julian's eyes widened. 5 years. Today is our 5th anniversary. "Exactly," Sarah said. "If you had waited one more day, if you hadn't filed for divorce, if you hadn't cheated, you would have legally owned half of a $40 billion estate. You would have been richer than God." "Julian!" Julian felt his knees give out. He grabbed the table for support. He had been one day away from everything he ever wanted. And he had thrown it away for Tiffany Blair and a pencil skirt. "But," Sarah continued, her voice sharpening like a blade, "because you filed for divorce before the vesting period ended. And because I have proof of infidelity." "Proof?" Tiffany squeaked. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a small USB drive. "The nanny cam," she said simply. "You thought I fired the nanny because she was stealing? No. I sent her away so I could install cameras. I have footage of you and Tiffany in my bed, Julian, discussing how you were going to kick the hag to the curb once you got the company public." She tossed the USB drive to the judge. "Because of the infidelity clause," Sarah finished. "Julian is not only disqualified from the trust, he is liable for a bad faith penalty. He owes the trust for every penny he spent during the marriage that wasn't strictly for the benefit of the household." Judge Sterling did the math in his head. "Mr. Thorne," he said gravely, "it appears you are not just bankrupt. You are in debt to your wife for approximately $12 million. Julian made a sound like a wounded animal. He looked at Tiffany, who was now weeping into her hands, ruining her mascara. He looked at Sarah, who was as unmovable as a mountain. "You ruined me," Julian whispered. "You planned this. You let me dig my own grave." "I gave you the shovel," Sarah said, "but you're the one who kept digging." Suddenly the doors opened again, but this time it wasn't a lawyer. 2 men in dark suits walked in. They wore earpieces and moved with military precision. They weren't police, they were private security. But behind them walked a man in a trench coat who flashed a badge. "FBI," the man announced. "We have a warrant for the arrest of Julian Thorne and Tiffany Blair." "What?" Tiffany shrieked. "Why me?" "Corporate espionage and wire fraud," the agent said. "It seems you two were trying to sell the Thorne Dynamics algorithm to a Chinese competitor last week. We've been monitoring your emails." Julian's jaw dropped. He looked at Tiffany. You sent those emails. You told me to," Tiffany screamed. You said we needed cash for the wedding. I said find cash, not sell the code. That's enough, the agent said, producing handcuffs. As the agents moved in, Sarah stood up. She picked up Leo and woke up Mia. She didn't look back at her husband as he was shoved against the wall and cuffed. She didn't look at the mistress being dragged out, kicking and screaming. She looked at Judge Sterling. "Can we go now, Your Honor?" she asked. "It's nap time." Judge Sterling looked at the chaos unfolding in his courtroom. The arrest, the ruined mogul, the screaming mistress. Then he looked at the mother, standing amidst the storm, holding her children. He smiled a genuine, warm smile. "Case dismissed," Sterling said, banging the gavel. "Go home, Ms. van der Hoven." But as Sarah walked out of the courtroom into the blinding flash of paparazzi cameras, she knew the story wasn't over. Julian was going to prison. Yes, but the van der Hoven family had enemies. And by revealing who she was, Sarah had just put a target on her back. She stepped into the hallway, and a man in a black suit stepped into her path. He wasn't FBI. He was older, with a scar running down his cheek. He looked at the twins, then at Sarah. "Your father sends his regards," the man said. "He wants to meet the grandchildren." Sarah froze. Her father was supposed to be in a coma in a Swiss clinic. That was the last she heard. "My father is incapacitated," she said, pulling the children closer. The man smiled, and it was cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins. "Miracles happen, Sarah," he said. "The car is waiting." The black SUV smelled of lemon leather and stale cigarette smoke. It was a scent that transported Sarah back 10 years to a time when she was just a frightened girl named Serafina van der Hoven, hiding in the back seat of armored convoys. She clutched Leo and Mia tight against her chest. The twins, sensing this tension, had gone unnervingly quiet. Leo stared at the man with the scar sitting opposite them. "Silas," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "You're graying." The man with the scar didn't smile. Silas had been her father's head of security since before she was born. He was a machine in a suit, efficient, lethal, and absolutely loyal to only one man. "Time comes for us all, Miss Sarah," Silas rumbled. He tapped the partition window. "Drive! Where are we going?" Sarah demanded, her fear beginning to curdle into anger. "The courthouse reporters saw me get into this car. You can't just disappear me." "We aren't disappearing you," Silas said, looking out the tinted window as the city skyline began to recede. "We are going home. The estate in the Hamptons. He's waiting." "He's in a coma," Sarah insisted, though a cold knot was tightening in her stomach. "I saw the medical reports. Massive stroke. Vegetation state." Silas finally looked at her. His eyes were devoid of pity. "Mr. van der Hoven pays a very good doctors to tell the world exactly what he wants them to hear. A coma is a convenient way to see who your true friends are, and to see which of your enemies get careless." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. It was a test. It was always a test with him. The drive took 2 hours. They pulled up to a wrought-iron gate that looked more like the entrance to a fortress than a home. The van der Hoven estate was a sprawling Gothic mansion perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks below a violent rhythm that matched the pounding of Sarah's heart. Silas opened the door. "Leave the bags. Bring the children." Sarah stepped out into the biting sea wind. She hoisted Mia onto her hip and took Leo's hand. They walked up the marble steps flanked by silent security guards, who looked more like mercenaries. The double doors opened. The foyer was exactly as she remembered it. Cold, expansive, and filled with priceless art that felt like it was watching her. "Library," Silas directed. Sarah walked to the end of the hall. The library doors were mahogany heavy and imposing. She pushed them open. The room was dim, lit only by the crackling fire in the massive stone hearth. Sitting in a high-backed leather wing chair, facing the fire, was a figure. "Hello, Serafina," a voice rasped. It sounded like dry leaves scraping on concrete. The chair swiveled slowly. Peter van der Hoven was older than she remembered. His skin was like parchment stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. He held a cane with a silver wolf's head handle. But his eyes, pale blue and piercing, were electric. They were the eyes of a predator that had not lost a step. "Father," Sarah said, standing her ground. She didn't move to hug him. He wasn't a hugging man. Peter didn't look at her. His gaze dropped immediately to the children. He studied them with a clinical detachment like a jeweler inspecting raw diamonds for flaws. "Identical," Peter murmured. "Good genes, strong jawlines. They have the look." "They have names," Sarah snapped. "Leo and Mia." "Pedestrian names," Peter scoffed. "Names for shopkeepers and clerks. We will change them. Something more dynastic. Leopold and Wilhelmina, perhaps." Sarah stepped back, shielding the twins with her body. "You aren't changing anything. We aren't staying. I just wanted to look you in the eye and tell you that I don't want your money. I exposed Julian, I took back the company, and now I'm going to sell it. I'm going to take the cash and disappear again." Peter threw his head back and laughed. It was a terrifying sound. "Sell it!" He shook his head, looking at her with mock disappointment. "You still think small, girl. You think you defeated Julian Thorne. Julian was a gnat. I let him marry you." The air left Sarah's lungs. "What? I knew where you were the whole time," Peter said, wheeling his chair closer. "I knew you were waitressing at that greasy spoon. I knew Thorne was courting you. I ran a background check on him before he even bought you that first cheap drink. You let me marry a con artist." "I let you marry a weak man," Peter corrected. "Because I needed to know if you were weak, too. I needed to see if 5 years of domestic drudgery would break you, if you would become a soft, pathetic housewife." He leaned forward, his face inches from hers. "But today you surprised me. You didn't just leave him. You destroyed him. You used the trust. You utilized the legal system as a weapon. That was ruthless, Serafina. That was van der Hoven." "I did it to protect my children," Sarah hissed. "And that is why you are here," Peter said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I am dying, Serafina. For real this time. The doctors give me 6 months. The Empire needs an heir. I thought I would have to skip a generation and train the twins myself. But perhaps you are salvageable." He pressed a button on the arm of his chair. The library doors locked with a heavy metallic thud. "But the children stay here," Peter declared. "They will be raised here, educated here. They will not go to public school. They will not eat processed garbage. They are royalty, and they will be raised in the castle." "No," Sarah said. "It wasn't a request," Peter said calmly. "You are currently wanted for questioning regarding the disappearance of sensitive data from the Thorne server's data that the FBI is very interested in. Silas can have the agents here in 10 minutes. You go to prison for corporate espionage, and I get custody. Or you stay here, take your place at my right hand, and we raise them together." He smiled. "Checkmate, my dear." The fire crackled, casting long dancing shadows against the walls of the library. Leo whimpered, hiding his face in Sarah's skirt. That sound, the sound of her son's fear, snapped something inside Sarah. She looked at her father. He sat there like a king on a throne, confident in his victory. He had played this game for 40 years. He had toppled governments and bankrupt economies. He thought he was playing chess against a novice. But he forgot one thing. Sarah hadn't just been a waitress for the last 5 years. She had been a coder, and before that, she had been his daughter. She knew how the machine worked because she had helped build the encryption that protected it. Sarah gently detached Leo from her leg. She crouched down, kissed him on the forehead, and whispered, "Profound quiet." It was a game they played. The twins immediately sat on the Persian rug and went silent, watching. Sarah stood up and smoothed her dress. She walked over to the mahogany desk where her father kept his decanter of brandy. She poured herself a glass, her hand perfectly steady. "You think you have leverage, father?" Sarah said, taking a sip. The brandy burned, grounding her. "You think because you control the lawyers and the judges you own me?" "I deal in realities, Serafina," Peter said, watching her with amusement. "The reality is you have no resources. You have no allies. You are a single mother with a stolen algorithm." "The algorithm isn't stolen," Sarah said, turning to face him. "And it isn't just an algorithm for a search engine, is it?" Peter's smile faltered slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Thorn dynamics," Sarah said, pacing slowly around the room. "On the surface, it's consumer tech, data mining for ads. But underneath the deep learning core, it's predictive analytics for geopolitical instability." She stopped and looked at him. Julian was too stupid to understand what the code was doing. He thought it was predicting stock trends. But I saw the logs, father. It was predicting riots. It was predicting coups d'etats in South America. And it was sending that data to a private server in Zurich, your server. Peter's hand tightened on his cane. The amusement was gone. "You have an active imagination." "I have the encryption key." Sarah lied. Or rather, it was a half-lie. She had the key to the back door she had installed years ago. She didn't know exactly what was in the files, but she knew enough to know it would bury him. "When I realized Julian was going to try and sell the company," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength, "I didn't just lock him out. I set up a dead man's switch. If I don't input a specific code into a secure terminal every 24 hours, the entire database, every bribe, every Black Ops contract, every illegal surveillance log automatically uploads to the servers of the New York Times, the FBI, and Interpol." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. Peter stared at her. For the first time in her life, Sarah saw something in his eyes that wasn't contempt. It was calculation. He was reassessing the threat level. "You're bluffing," Peter said softly. "Am I?" Sarah pulled her phone from her pocket. She held it up. "It's been 23 hours since my last check-in. I have 58 minutes left. If you have Sunglas arrest me, I can't enter the code. If you take my children, I won't enter the code. And if you try to hurt me, well, the world finds out that the great Peter van der Hoven isn't a businessman, but a war criminal." She took a step closer to him. "You called Julian a gnat," she said. "But you forgot that I'm the one who designed the fly swatter." Peter stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. Then slowly a smile spread across his face. It wasn't the cruel smile from before. It was a smile of genuine, terrifying pride. Silas, Peter called out, not looking away from his daughter. The security chief stepped out of the shadows. Sir, cancel the call to the FBI, Peter said, and prepare the guest wing. My daughter and grandchildren will be staying for dinner. We aren't staying for dinner, Sarah said firmly. We are leaving. Now. You are going to provide us with a secure residence, not here, somewhere neutral. You will transfer the full legal custody of the children to me uncontested, and you will sign over the deed to the trust without the 5-year vesting period. And if I refuse, then I let the clock run out, Sarah said. She tapped her phone screen. 55 minutes. Peter looked at the phone, then back at Sarah. He chuckled a dry, rattling sound. You really are my daughter, he said. Ruthless, manipulative, dangerous. I learned from the best, Sarah replied coldly. Peter waved his hand at Silas. Do as she says. Get the helicopter ready. Take them to the penthouse in Manhattan, the one on 5th Avenue. He looked at the twins who were still sitting quietly on the rug. Leopold, Wilhelmina, Peter said, tasting the names again. They will be formidable. Fine. You win this round, Serafina. But remember, owning the crown is easy. Keeping it on your head while everyone tries to cut your throat. That is the hard part. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Sarah said. She picked up the twins. And I'm not Serafina. My name is Sarah Thorne. And I'm done running. She turned and walked toward the door. Silas opened it for her, stepping aside with a newfound deference. As she walked down the hallway clutching her children, Sarah's legs felt like jelly. She was shaking. It had been a bluff. There was no dead man's switch. There was no auto-upload to Interpol. She had just poker-faced the most dangerous man in the world, and won. But as she stepped out into the night air, the wind whipping her hair, she knew her father was right about one thing. This wasn't the end. Julian was gone, but now she was a player on a much larger board. She had the money, she had the power, and she had the targets on her back. She strapped the kids into the waiting helicopter. As the rotors began to spin, lifting them away from the dark Gothic mansion, Sarah looked down at the lights of New York City in the distance. She had her freedom. She had her children. But the game had just begun. 6 months later, the view from the 45th floor of the fictional Aurora Tower was breathtaking. Central Park looked like a green patch on a grey quilt, and the cars below were mere specks of dust. Sarah stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, sipping an espresso. She wasn't wearing the faded floral dress anymore. She wore a tailored black blazer, sharp trousers, and stiletto heels that clicked with authority against the marble floor. Ms. van der Hoven. Sarah turned. Her assistant, a young man named David, stood in the doorway, looking nervous. It's just Sarah. David. She corrected him gently, though her eyes remained steel. What is it? The board of directors is waiting, David said. And there's a letter from the upstate correctional facility. Sarah's expression didn't change. She walked over to her desk, a massive slab of obsidian that used to belong to Julian. She took the letter. The handwriting on the envelope was jagged, desperate. Julian Thorne. She didn't open it. The news had broken 3 months ago. Julian had pleaded guilty to wire fraud and embezzlement to avoid the espionage charges. He was serving 8 years. Tiffany had turned state's witness to save her own skin, receiving probation and community service. But her social standing was dead. The last Sarah heard Tiffany was working retail in New Jersey, trying to pay off legal debts. Sarah opened her desk drawer and dropped the unopened letter inside, right next to the others. Indifference, she had learned, was a far harsher punishment than anger. "Burn it," she said, closing the drawer, "and tell the board I'll be there in 5 minutes. I'm bringing the children." "The children, ma'am?" "Yes." Sarah smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's take your child to work day, and they need to learn how the company works. They own it, after all." She walked into the private nursery she had built adjacent to her office. Leo and Mia were sitting on a plush rug, focused intently on a low table. "Knight to F3, Leo mumbled, moving a wooden piece. "Pawn takes knight," Mia countered, her small hand knocking his piece over. Sarah watched them for a moment, a swell of pride and fear rising in her chest. They were learning fast. Too fast. On the table between them sat a chess set. It wasn't just any set. It was hand-carved ivory and ebony, a gift that had arrived yesterday via courier. There was no card, just a note with a wax seal of a wolf's head to the new players. It was from her father. Peter kept his distance, staying in his fortress in the Hamptons, but he was watching. He knew her bluff about the dead man's switch was a lie, or at least he suspected it. But he also knew that in the last 6 months, Sarah had actually built the leverage she claimed to have. She had cleaned house at the company, fired Julian's cronies, and secured the encrypted files for real. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was the queen on the board, protecting her 2 pawns until they could become kings and queens themselves. "Mommy." Leo looked up, beaming. "I'm winning." "Only because I let you," Mia argued. Sarah knelt down, smoothing their hair. "The game isn't about winning fast, Leo. It's about surviving the longest. Come on, put on your jackets. We have a meeting." "With the boring men in suits?" Mia asked, wrinkling her nose. "Yes," Sarah said, standing up and offering a hand to each of them. "But remember what I told you. They work for us. Never let them see you scared. Never let them see you tired." She walked them out of the nursery, through the executive suite, and toward the boardroom. As the double doors opened, the room full of older, wealthy men fell silent. They stood up in unison, buttoning their jackets, respect etched into their faces, respect born of fear. Sarah walked to the head of the table. She sat down, pulling Leo onto her lap, while Mia sat in the empty chair beside her. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, her voice clear and commanding. "Let's begin. The rebranding of Thorn Dynamics ends today. Welcome to the era of Aurora." She looked at her reflection in the polished wood of the table. The waitress was gone. The victim was gone. In her place was a mother. And God help anyone who tried to touch her family again. Wow, what a journey. From a disregarded wife in a faded dress to the CEO of a billion-dollar empire, Sarah proved that you should never judge a book by its cover, or a waitress by her apron. Julian and Tiffany learned the hard way that when you play with fire, you don't just get burned, you lose everything. But what do you think? Did Sarah go too far by hiding her identity for 5 years? Or was it the ultimate test of true love that Julian failed? And do you think her father, Peter, is really going to stay away? Or is he planning his next move? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and revenge, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.